So to those of you who are meeting for the first time, I'm Elena Antonacopoulou. I am faculty at Ivy Business School and also very much here with colleagues at the Center for Organizational Resilience. And what I chose to share with you today is work in progress rather than some of my published work, because I wanted to provoke some collective thinking and I wanted to invite your feedback, particularly in the kind of programs of research that we're setting up in the center, that I think we need to not only make you aware of and engage you more, but I think with the benefit of your feedback we can strike it more effectively. The focus I am going to orientate is around leadership development and management education, and I feel the two need to come closer together, because in this post-pandemic era with greater calls for our scholarship to attend to broader agendas, and when we speak about impact, it's really about attending to practical issues that bring about the social change. My own research evolves around this agenda and the future of work. And my take on leadership is as an event. So I worked with Ted Fuller to orientate the idea of emplacement, which I will tell you more about in this presentation, in relation to entrepreneurship. We're also developing it in an attempt to understand leadership itself. But today I'm going to show you how I've been trying to develop emplacement as a pedagogical approach. And what does that do to advance our response to helping shape the future of work, educate and support the development of humanity in attending to these UN sustainability goals, and where does that leave us in our understanding of management itself? And I guess you can see that my emphasis on hyphenation is an attempt to maybe suggest that management could mean differently. So my starting point is the recognition that at this important post-pandemic juncture, this critical moment in time when none of us really knows what are the answers, we must generate more questions. And because leaders across organizations have rather uncertainty around how do we construct and map a future, that what we can be certain of is that volatility, complexity, uncertainty, ambiguity will be the norm. How do we foster a response? And this is one of the initial takes of what we are anticipating the World Economic Forum will formally announce as the markings of the fifth industrial revolution. That really the next chapter and what constitutes our future is not just sustainability development goals, but sustaining humanity itself. So human flourishing is starting to become an agenda that we need to turn attention to, more than growing leaders, and certainly far more than developing managers into leaders. So you can see that for me this presents a learning challenge, and as a learning scholar predominantly, I see myself, and as an educator, as needing to pose this kind of question as to what constitutes human flourishing. And here is a humble attempt to define it, and that's how we've placed it in the context of the Center for Organizational Resilience research agenda, that the focus of resilience is not bouncing back and it's not being proactive, but that becoming and sustaining resilience is an ongoing process of flourishing, where flourishing is an entanglement in the ecology, and I think I symbolize that by bringing Dexter along, that there is more to human supremacy in understanding the environment and the world that we co-create, and even more so therefore these calls in our attempt to make VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, what I call here navigating the unknown, as embedded in our efforts to foster sustainable, responsible, and ethical leadership, so that we can bring the best in people, place, and planet. Now, that's rhetorical, you might say. So where does that leave us? So these are the two questions I wanted to invite us to deliberate in today's research day. How has the pandemic changed what responsibility is for managers and should thus be for our students? And how has this pandemic changed your responsibilities individually? And for those of you who were in last year's Responsible Management Education Conference, this is an ongoing agenda that drew inspiration from those discussions a year ago and continues. So what I'm bringing to the presentation today is some of the earlier work to help address some of these questions. Because certainly the experience of working with colleagues at Ivy and being outside the UK higher education system for the first time after over 20 years of service in the UK has really allowed me to appreciate not just other innovation in teaching and learning practice, but really how do we approach attending to the issue of responsibility. You know, how do we educate for responsibility? We've published and edited, we've edited a special issue in the Journal of Business Ethics on responsible management learning with 3 colleagues. And for us, this provided the invitation for us to extend rethinking responsibility and how we cultivate it, so that we go beyond recognizing responsibility as the ability to respond, but to really appreciate how practical judgment, what Aristotle referred to as phronesis, plays a key part. Now, the notion of responsibilization is embedded in marketing debates already, and we know that this is what has brought about social changes and changes in civilian and in customer behavior or citizens' habits, as otherwise referred to. Take an example, the use of plastic bags and their elimination. Responsibilization was the process that enabled, through this PAC framework that is often promoted, the personalization of why we needed to eliminate plastic, the authorization, the capacity for retailers to be authorized to now charge for plastic bags, the capitalization, the alternatives in a number of other options you could use to carry your groceries, for example, and of course the ultimate transformation, which was changing the habits and embedding the limited use of plastic, which of course we have a long way to go. But I think for me, more fundamentally, it brings to the forefront something that I know it's not new, but it is about the ways we live our values and act with ownership. That is, for me, where accountability lies, and where responsibility enhances this kind of position because it lies also in the dynamics of character and conscience and not only competence. Now, this has been a long-standing issue in my work, and you will see in a minute how I've approached it in other policy reports that I have produced. But just again, for clarity, let me say a few more words about what this notion of responsibilization. Can I make anybody responsible? I mean, it bothers me to even ask that question. Right, but then if we as educators don't own up to our impact in creating leaders fit for management, then what are we doing? So this idea of responsibilization as the process of internalizing social values and ensuring that these values are built into practice is part of the wider growing agenda around the notion of the common good, which Eleanor Ostrom has promoted and which has been embedded now within debates in the World Economic Forum and the notion of the Fifth Industrial Revolution, I said already. The thesis that colleagues who have initiated some of this thinking propose is that the conditions that support responsibilization include awareness of roles and responsibilities amongst actors and the relationship of trust between actors. To that, I would like to add the notion of dignity, which is for me and worthiness, which is fundamental and I think often absent in the ways in which we cultivate humanity, if indeed we appreciate that management education's purpose is also addressing this priority. So these are some of the research questions that have been guiding what we have been designing also in the Center for Organizational Resilience in the form of a new program, research program with a strong and unique pedagogical approach, which I will tell you about. But in a nutshell, clearly the way in which we educate more than teach is about how do we foster responsible management practices, how do we cultivate practices that go beyond the tendency to avoid doing harm, and of course that's central to already the Sustainable MBA motivation and underpinning in its design that colleagues here have been promoted, but it's also using the lens of innovation and sustainability to support how does a given responsible management practice represent a departure from usual ways of doing things. How does a given responsible management practice prioritize and support the creation of societal value to employees and other stakeholders? And what are the challenges and limits of this responsible management practice? So to me, these are as much questions that mobilize the kind of invitation for reflexivity. And again, our approach to reflexivity here is slightly different, and I will explain in a minute how. But as we pose these questions also to organizations we work at the Center for Organizational Resilience, we as educators, with Sally Newham, Dean, Fathers, and of course Hilary Ducker, are continuing to pose these questions in terms of our teaching and learning practice. Now, in 2016, I had the opportunity to work with the think tank Respublica to produce a report that provided a reflexive critique about how can we restore trust to professions and professionals. Because even despite after the financial crisis, the recurrent misconduct cases were only but continuing to undermine and therefore continue to cause crisis in institutional and professional life, which prompted me to coin the notion that what we are witnessing here is not lack of professionalism, nor lack of regulation, nor whether ethical codes of conduct are adequate in order to police or monitor responsible behavior, but really some underpinning issues around what kind of quality of a human being are we choosing to become when we're busy acting. And these are the kind of questions we haven't been asking, I don't think, which is all the more why this notion of the crisis in leadership was going obviously beyond competence and addressing issues of character, which my colleagues at Ivy Business School set up a whole leadership institute for. And of course, I argue that there is a need for greater conscience. Now, this, of course, for me, reveals the power of ineptitude, which I define here as professionals who do not demonstrate the public accountability and responsibility in serving the common good, but then that leaves us with a learning crisis in the sense of what kind of learning do we promote and why does choice of action ultimately is what underpins the issues and the solutions. Again, this is just a framework to show you how I then use this in order to rethink how we understand professional conduct and why critique is the linchpin across all these levels by refocusing beyond the treatment of values and the value of values and how we evaluate what we value and why it matters. This notion of axia, which in the Greek language is the notion of worthiness, and that's where dignity is embedded. And to that, I've built the notion of axiology as a way of accounting for responsibilization. So this brings us beyond notions of values, virtues, or beliefs, and aligns ways of seeing, ways of being, with ways of becoming in advancing our humanity. Central to that is the notion of emplacement and what we understand worthiness to mean. For the purposes of this analysis, for me, emplacement is defined as taking a stance and standing up for what we stand for. Which redresses issues of misplacement, displacement, or mistreatment, particularly in the growing interest around the EDI agenda. And by placing a new place for which we can refer, pressed too quickly. this is just to give you this idea of what we're working on, is the notion of extending our current takes on IQ, EQ to propose the notion of core intelligence. And that draws on empirical research, ethnographic research I have done with the Norwegian military, where when they undertake any mission, they find themselves committed to unfolding and re-emerging their plan of action, not by following the plan, but by engaging beyond their sensibility or sensitivity to the circumstances, their salience. And that's something you alluded to in your opening remarks as well. So for me, sensuousness becomes a capacity building central to responsibilization, because it's about widening our capacity for vibrations and sensations to create that which is experienced and that which acts as a sediment that underpins our conscious experience. And this is just a way of convincing you that aside from the dominance of the mind and separation from the body, neuroscientists have now confirmed that there are more connections in our gut than there are in our brain. So if we place intelligence beyond the prominence of mind, mindsets, mindfulness, dare I say, maybe we have a chance not to trust intuition and the gut instinct, but to do the work, to know when it feels right, and knowing that responsibility is located at the very core of what defines us as humans. And that's why I've built a community of scholars, practitioners, and policymakers who for 5 years work together, and artists. And for 5 years we worked together and we published 28 books where we show the use of art-based methods as a way of cultivating professional judgment and practical judgment across different practices. Just to show you how I have been applying that in an undergraduate course, I have been getting my students to record videos of some of their everyday practices, and by sharing them, to raise wider awareness about the multiplicity of ways in which frying an egg, for all I care about, can be done. But then what are the assumptions that we make in terms of our approach, not just to consumption, consuming that food that we have just cooked, but what has preceded and constituted its preparation before its consumption. And by raising awareness, then this has redefined our relationship, because in all honesty, I've learned so much more about their habits and what they may be prepared to change. And therefore, that prompted us collectively to start asking, okay, so what other practices can we agree could be instigated that we would be prepared to commit to? With two other colleagues, we have a forthcoming paper in the Journal of Business Ethics, looking at how we can unpack responsible management competence by creating these different categorizations. Again, for me, this brings a greater alignment between our thinking, our emotions, but also our actions. And I want to leave you with what we have been trying to do in this impact learning program we've designed and we have launched in the Center for Organizational Resilience, with a commitment to advance man-agement, which is human flourishing, nurturing maturity in our humanity. And central to the program's design is fostering, beyond reviewing their everyday practices or reflecting by looking at the same issue from different perspectives, the emphasis on reflexivity, which practitioners are finding both hard but also deeply meaningful once they've understood what this is about. So in a recent base camp, which I came here for us to launch, which we're fast approaching to the end of our first year working with this organization, they are starting to appreciate what it means to be inside, performing your practice, and simultaneously having the capacity to distance yourself, to see the impact of what you're doing. And that is how we have been approaching reflexivity. Alongside conscientization, Freiere's notion of conscientization, which extends beyond their ability to do things, or indeed being a good person, which, by the way, we have seen lacking in the sense that there are no measures of character that really can guarantee you will conduct yourself responsibly. All the more why we wanted to foster curiosity, confidence, but also a greater appreciation in how choice is exercised. And this is how we have already tested empirical this framework with the Secretary of Education. We have applied it in previous research with the military, and now we are embedding it in the context of our collaboration with these organizations in order for us to have something to say about how this inquiry, which is how we treat research as a management practice, and that is perhaps the critical innovation we bring. We don't want to take them out of the point of action. We embed inquiry and research in the point of action so that we can enhance, hopefully, their readiness, enable them to recognize their resilience through their commitment to flourishing, and their renewal as just part and parcel of their effort to remain engaged with the process of growth. And that's what we do.